According to a recent Pew report, 74% of black adults said that being black is either extremely important or very important to their identity. By comparison, 60% of Hispanics and 56% of Asian adults say that being Hispanic or Asian, respectively, is extremely important or very important to their identity. Only 15% of white adults see race as central to who they are. This confirmed earlier Pew polling from 2016 and 2017 that also showed that blacks were significantly more likely than other demographic groups to say that race was central to how they view themselves. It's obvious, be it from these surveys or lived experience, most blacks see race as central and critical to their identity at levels not seen amongst their demographic counterparts. Now, racial identity has been a priority for black Americans since the end of the Civil Rights Movement. However, our racialized identity is too narrowly and intrinsically defined and dependent on racial victimization or oppression. Collectively defining ourselves as racial victims has resulted in blacks suffering from a negative self-image and a crisis of being in the post-civil rights period of multiracial integration. Racial victimization, crucial to our identity, is partially seen as a result of not having reached socioeconomic equity with whites. Now, that a racial gap exists is enough proof for some to confirm the persistence of systemic racism. But it's at the expense of other, more influential factors that would better explain these quality of life discrepancies. Essentializing our race, along with the conviction and customary exploitation of racial grievance, gained traction with the Black Power movement. This followed the moral revolution for freedom and justice and was a more aggressive movement that emphasized black race pride and identity, pursued social and economic access that required outcome-based equality, and demanded financial reimbursement for past sufferings. This was the beginning of our identity crisis. Consequently, a general awareness of racial self-doubt and unresolved feelings of inadequacy are the products of belonging to a cultural group whose legacy of inhumanity was rooted in slavery, then as second-class citizens under segregation. Considering this heritage, it's understandable to a degree that this endowment would contribute to a sense of racial insecurity or a lack of national belonging. In response to these feelings, blacks have repeatedly attempted to reinvent or redefine black identity to elevate in-group self-esteem. The intergenerational efforts to racially redefine who we are in pursuit of pride may be the reality that too many blacks have little to no conception of who we are apart from historical oppression. It could also be an indirect acknowledgement that we haven't taken full advantage of validating ourselves through innumerable opportunities that are now open to us thanks to the racial victories of the 1960s. Taken together, this has significantly compromised individual and group self-determination and confidence, self-understanding, and earned achievement conditioned only on our ability to excel. The principal importance put on racial identity, its dependency on racial victimization, and the psychological consequences of our identity being contingent upon victimization has led to this identity crisis. This crisis is defined as being dependent on our politicized racial identity, which consists of cultural traits, ideological preferences and demands, political support and behavior, the relationship with historical oppression, and the subsequent grievances, the latter of which has precipitated a broad sense of entitlement. This identity crisis is further defined by the insistence that people, groups, and institutions or society in general treat us with a certain racial privilege, granting us special dispensations as restitution for historical discrimination, said to be tied to the contemporary causes of black suffering and underdevelopment. Because blacks suffered in the past, it's suggested that it's not only unfair, but it's unreasonable to hold blacks to universal measures of character in the rigor of merit-based achievement. Contemptuously, this broadly accepted idea declares that blacks are still victimized by discrimination, such that anyone who judges blacks as equals is essentially blaming the victim. This is the opposite of Reverend Martin Luther King's dream. Now, when candidly examined, these special privileges have been consistent with lower standards and expectations for blacks when compared to our peers. But if we're really being honest, we know this delicate treatment is increasingly distinguished by having no standards and no expectations with respect to black intelligence and capability, be it in moral, academic, social, and economic capacities. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the hard bigotry of no expectations, self-destructively permitted by blacks and validated by far too many whites. This is what racial dependency has done. This compassion-based bigotry is thought to be more favorable to blacks than being judged by the same principles and expectations as our counterparts. Blacks approving of lower standards not only undermines our aptitude, but places varying levels of black accomplishment under suspicion. Any individual or group that lacks confidence in their ability to succeed will embrace lower standards or the removal of standards altogether as a means for advancement. This is a form of self-contempt. It is the in-group reinstitution and admission that blacks are still separate and unequal. It reinforces the stigma of inferiority based on the metaphysics of race that justifies societal intercession on our behalf, doing for us what our intermediaries don't think that we can do for ourselves. This paternalism encourages and reinforces black disempowerment and black disability. And I have to say, manufactured merit and equity are always and everywhere the enemy of black development because it incentivizes trading on the presumed racial weakness rather than our own ability, which is naturally developed through trial and error. This provision and expectation of special treatment is in part the result of too many blacks not having achieved a sense of national identity, belonging, and accomplishment in America on our own terms. The cultural elites in the race grievance industry have persuaded far too many blacks to reject a comprehensive commitment to full participation in America. This grievance elite has convinced blacks that America remains stuck in a pre-civil rights era, a country where we are still persecuted by white supremacists hell-bent on terrorizing black lives. Now, this couldn't be farther from the truth. Rejecting this narrative and welcoming national inclusivity would require surrendering what many blacks hold most dear, our hyper-racialized identity of historical persecution repeatedly used as leverage for socioeconomic provisions. We enjoy the advantages that come with living in America, but we remain reluctant in fulfilling the requirements of full integration that the civil rights movement began. Straddling the fence preserves the feelings of resentment, self-consciousness, and hostility. This part American, continually angry, and perpetually oppressed community-wide attitude severely constrains black development, autonomy, and frustrates the comprehensive realization of existential well-being. This crisis compromises our national welfare by preventing civic conciliation in society at large. It sacrifices our ability to determine our own fate as Americans by requiring racial solidarity and ideological conformity in combination with external mediation that sabotages our progress. It compels a collectivization at the expense of individual liberty. Celebrating one's racial identity it isn't of itself a bad thing, but what is unproductive is the way we have chosen to define and accentuate our identity. We've tried to increase racial dignity at the expense of more important factors like our individuality, personal development, competition and achievement, critical thinking, and a host of other issues, all of which leads to a higher sense of contentment and are more reflective of a real sense of pride. These failed attempts at recreating ourselves through racial imagery have come at the expense of our national identity. Until the civil rights victories of the 1960s, blacks identified as Negroes. Though a more polite designation compared to other descriptions, such as being called colored or the N-word, Negro became too closely identified with the passivity of the nonviolent integrationist ethics of the civil rights movement. Negro was discarded particularly by those who were converted to the Black Power movement in favor of the label black, a racial self-redefinition and reclamation of a word that whites had disparaged. For the Black Power advocates, being black was now beautiful, full of pride and confidence, assertive rather than passive, as it belligerently challenged what was said to be the remnants of institutional racism. Most importantly, being black now meant the rejection of integration in favor of a pluralistic separation resulting from the influence of black nationalism. Nurturing black cultural pride led to blacks to identify as African-American, or Afro-American, a development that included celebrating Afrocentric cultural traits as an appreciation and sentimentalization of Africa. Eventually, this too was dropped in favor of African-American, a hyphenated designation of one's membership in two different historical periods, two different geographies, and two different cultures. This too evolved into African-American, no hyphen, a seemingly dignified, proper identity rather than a modified one. Now this term is increasingly being splintered into the acronym ADOS, A-D-O-S, African Descendant of Slaves, which is a strange nobility associated with oppression. The splintering also includes a more destructive sociological construct, the catch-all term people of color, which is a clear throwback to colored people, an unpleasant appellation given to blacks during segregation. We've come full circle. Shelby Steele said in his book, A Dream Deferred, the price paid is to suppress individuals with the mark of race just as certainly as segregation did, by relentlessly telling them that their racial identity is the most important thing about them, that it opens to them an opportunism in society that is not available to them as individuals. Black politics and identity since the 60s has been based on this hidden incentive to repress individuality so as to highlight the profitable collective identity. He goes on in his other book, Content of Our Character, doesn't race enhance individuality? I think it does, but only when individuality is nurtured and developed apart from race. The race holder feels inadequate or insecure and then seeks reassurance through race, when instead a sense of self arises from an individual achievement and self-realization. When self-esteem is established apart from race, then racial identity can only enhance it because it is no longer needed for any other purpose. The moral foundation of the civil rights movement was that it minimized race as a legitimate rationale for racial dehumanization. The morality of this position, minimizing race as a rationale for racial hierarchy, is now held in contempt. Thanks to identity politics, the opposite is now true. Race must be used as a social totem to determine who's essential and who isn't. The obsession with race has significantly contributed to increased racial discord, which has further distressed our national ties. Attempting to create and recreate ourselves and our racial image to improve our self-consciousness and recover self-respect both internally and externally has been unsuccessful. Because Black identity maintains a proposition of being never-ending victims of white supremacy and oppression, it's very hard to argue that improved self-esteem is attainable by self-defining oneself or one's group as permanently victimized. Trying to personify racialized distinctions that serve as a foundation for respectability or an emotional bomb used as consolation for terrible things that happened in the past discourages us from using the available resources and prospects to build our future in America as Americans as we see fit. A solution to our identity crisis is for Blacks to reject racial self-definition and define ourselves by our national identity. Rather than being Black Americans or African Americans or people of color or some other exaggerated construction of our racial identity, Blacks should define ourselves as American, full stop. The transcendence of our national identity surpasses the reductionism and assumed determinism of our race-based identity. Now, my parents were born and raised under segregation, so I know America hasn't always been kind to us. I've also experienced discrimination, which I see as a diminishing reflection of an America that no longer exists. Persistent emphasis on the negative prevents us from acknowledging the many good things the country has done and has attempted to do to atone for its injustices. It also prevents Blacks from celebrating the resiliency that has led to the religious, cultural, economic, and political success of Blacks as Americans in full view of the struggles that we have faced. In a phrase, we have overcome. Blacks should reject the separatist attitude that nourishes estrangement. We must embrace our national identity. We have a responsibility to adopt a sense of and rootedness in America because we are American. We should immediately accept an Americanism that will allow us to have confidence in our ability to achieve the fullness of human potential, not as exiles, but as citizens. Reverend King prophetically said in his last speech before he was killed that he had been to the mountaintop, that he had seen the promised land, and that we as a people would get to the promised land. King had faith in America and her potential. He had faith in Blacks as well. For some Blacks, establishing our national identity before our racial identity will be an act of faith. But as one pastor put it, faith isn't just about learning how to get to the promised land. Faith is learning how to live in the promised land. America is our home. She is not perfect, but she is good. Despite our country's internal contradictions, Blacks who live in America enjoy the highest quality of life than any other Blacks living in any other place in the world, and it's not even close. Therefore, we must dispense with recounting the sins of the past. People are getting tired of hearing it. No amount of anger, shame, or emotional manipulation of our fellow Americans can change history. Most white people will never feel the sense of shame or remorse that Blacks think is commensurate with the evils of the past. What happened, happened. But accepting our national identity shows that the tribulations of the past don't define who we are, nor does it determine our future. Our American identity is a response to our identity crisis and is a practical approach to overcoming the countless limitations and frustrations inherent in prioritizing racial uplift. Embracing the superiority of our national identity works against the constricted, coercive racialism and divisiveness of Black Lives Matter and the deception of the 1619 Project. It frustrates the fractionalized limitations of identity politics. It diminishes the internal feelings of victimization, anger, and manipulation that underlie the impetus for reparations. Deliberately accepting our national identity will enhance our quality of life, and I truly believe that. National pride in who we are can produce a life less consumed with racial paranoia and feelings of discrimination, anger, bitterness, and self-doubt. By accepting our national identity above our racial identity, Blacks will send a clear message that we see and believe ourselves to be equally American. As equals, Blacks will demand to be treated and judged by identical standards expected of others. While in direct competition with our peers, we will demonstrate that we are able to meet and exceed these standards. We will irrevocably establish our equality based on our self-determination and realization rather than the fabricated parity and false sense of accomplishment established by the benevolent chauvinism of those who patronizingly intervene on our behalf. The courage to flourish should affirm for some and reaffirm for others, an appreciation for how far Blacks have come in such a short period of time. It couldn't have happened anywhere else. Courage, determination, and national pride should be the foundation upon which we take advantage of today's prospects to establish exactly who we are, Americans. Thank you.